Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing White Rage. White Rage by Carol Anderson explains the reality that Black efforts at progress and achievement are often met with resistance and a retrenchment of obstacles. Since the Civil Rights Movement, and especially during riots, much has been made of Black people angrily lashing out against injustices and a lack of access to resources. Instead of focusing on the issues that lead to protests and riots, greater attention is often placed on what's referred to as Black Rage and calls for adherence to respectability politics. Anderson examines America's historic and present white rage, the systemic oppression of Black progress. When I began reading this book, the first thing that stood out to me was language, as in the author's writing style. I don't mind academic books as long as they're interesting. I don't like overly flowery prose. I don't like long preambles. I prefer that you just tell me what you're going to tell me and don't tell me in advance what you're going to tell me next. When I began reading the book, it immediately jumped out to me that while I didn't quite know what to expect, that I might actually enjoy reading this book. From the very beginning, the writing is clear and straight to the point. Forceful isn't really the word, but maybe passionate. Descriptive in the sense that you can read about events, ideas, and other related things, and it's just a conveyance of facts, but there's no feeling or emotion behind it. It's just like regurgitating of facts or of what occurred. That the author has a point that they want to make, but they don't necessarily browbeat you with their perspective. Instead, they present information, but do so in such a way as to make you care enough to have an opinion. I was very impressed by the author's writing style. It's sharp, very fast moving, and immediately draws you in. Over the last few years, and it's something that's been occurring far beyond that, maybe within the last decade or so, a little bit more than that actually, going back to the late 90s, you've been having these instances of Black people being inexplicably murdered or victims of excessive or unnecessary force at the hands of law enforcement, but also private citizens. The thing that's often expressed is that you have the frequent refrain of the individual killing the Black person, stating that they were in fear for their life or they felt that they were in danger, something along those lines. As the author points out here, these kinds of emotions build up over time. You've had several instances where people are frustrated in these communities, in the Black community. And those frustrations, when an event like this occurs, either the brutal beating of an individual, the murder, or something along those lines, it's like a spark in a powder keg, where there's been this simmering feeling, emotions and issues just right below the surface. And there's an event that occurs that just lights a spark. It brings attention to these issues. This is the case if you look back at, let's say, the riots in the 60s, right? So like in Watts, Chicago, other places around the country, where, sure, you had the civil rights movement, but out west in the north, you had riots, which is something that's often touched on here, right? In the South, you have open racism, or you have a history of open and very aggressive racism. That's not to say that racism doesn't exist in the North or didn't exist in the North and the West, but rather that it's usually more subtle, right? It's not to say you don't have individual racism, but it's subtly built into the structure, whereas it's the same in the South, but the difference is that at that point in time, in addition to structural racism, much of it was out in the open, right? Individual, local, community basis. These riots are sort of, you have this subdued frustration, this unexpressed anger in the North and West due to unequal living conditions, much as in the South. But it's just that it takes a different form. So there are issues with regards to unequal access to education, employment, healthcare, housing, all of these social and economic issues. They exist in both the North and the South. They just take on slightly different forms. They're presented in different ways. So in the North and South, where you have more subdued types of racism, which then it feeds into this frustration, right? It tends to be more subdued in the people as well until something happens and it breaks free. It explodes. In more recent years, actions might be taken, right? Actions might be lacking, but they certainly speak about, police brutality, injustice, prejudice. In the past, there was a tendency to play into or shift the conversation by focusing on respectability politics. So instead of discussing unfair policing tactics, aggression on the part of the police, extreme and unnecessary use of violence and force by the police, instead of discussing those very real topics, or even the source of crime in poor and minority neighborhoods, you would have a greater focus on what Black people should be doing to avoid negative interactions with the police. Instead of addressing being improper training, prejudice, or whatever the case might be, the victim would be blamed. right, for the situation that's occurred. The author points out the tendency for people speaking on these topics to refer to and focus entirely on what's termed Black rage. So Black people being angry and lashing out against these injustices, against these frustrations in the forms of riots or protests, things along those lines. I know that when riots occur, unfortunately, sometimes there's like looting and whatnot, but that tends to get a lot of attention as well, right? The damage to property, rather than the tensions and things of this nature, the disruption of how things function on a day-to-day basis, right? That takes center stage. The conversation shifts away from the conditions and circumstances that led to this explosion in activity, the events that led up to the protests or riots. The focus instead is placed on what Black people could do to stop these injustices. Like there's a lack of accountability the other way. What Anderson does is she's coined the term white rage, or rather the system that's in place to make these things possible as white rage. In reading several books, especially over the last year, I've been reading a lot of nonfiction, right? Books more focused on not so much profiling an individual or organization or event, but more so on the economic history of Black people in America and at times around the world. And the author's description or explanation for the term white rage really clicked for me. The reason being that through these different books, while they focus on specific but different areas of economics, there's generally some degree of overlap. And so what I've found frequently, even in instances of reading about individuals, is that the history of Black people in America has typically been taking one step forward and two steps back. Where at whatever instances Black people take advantage of the opportunity or make opportunities for themselves to progress, typically there's some kind of initiative or action taken to push them back. We see this following slavery with Reconstruction, during Jim Crow. That entire system was created to pretty much keep Black people in an inferior position. We see this even during the Civil Rights Movement, where essentially you have battles of different kinds, but essentially it's fights to continue the subjugation of Black people. I read the explanation of white rage and immediately got what the author was expressing, which is this concentrated effort to dial back through force, legislation, etc., any attempts that Black people make to improve themselves or improve their circumstances. So the author terms this as being white rage rather than Black rage, right? Black rage is sort of used by the media when describing actions like rioting or looting, things along those lines, protests and whatnot, when an injustice is carried out against a Black person. But white rage is used as the term to explain and express the reality that those things kind of, like they shift focus, right? It's a way of changing the subject. The reality of the way to stop these, let's say, flare-ups of these eruptions or disruptions would be to address and eradicate the problems that cause them. But it's not in broader society's best interest to do so. Instead, when these incidents take place, there's a lot of conversation, but not a lot of action behind implementing change. Not just with regards to law enforcement or the criminal justice system, but we see this with regards to education, housing, employment. It's like everything possible is done to deny these injustices while at the same time defending and keeping them in place. So, and that's like just in the opening pages of the book, which is an incredible start. The really poignant and relevant points continue to be made as the author moved on from just providing a general overview and introduction to the book and the concept of white rage to more deeply discussing specific eras in American Black history. The book goes into discussing eras of white rage, where the first one to be discussed is actually the period following the Civil War. In this period, you have the newly emancipated slaves trying to make their way in America. Having lost the Civil War, the South is kind of aghast, disgusted by the reality of these people that they once owned now having freedom. The possibility that with freedom, with equal opportunity, with opportunities for advancement, opportunities to progress and achieve some degree of success or independence, stability, Black people would raise the situation, right? Improve their lives. And through that would come about, or it would offer them the option to no longer work for white people. And failing or lacking the ability to pay, they might have to do that work for themselves. Lincoln's plan for unification or reunification of the United States was, he kind of floated the idea of taking Black people from America and just sending them somewhere else. Like he regarded them as being the problem, as being these enslaved people who quite honestly were first across the Atlantic, right? Like brought to America by force. He regarded them as being the troublemakers, as being the cause of this great and bloody war. So, surprise, surprise, that these people, although they'd been enslaved for generations at this point, did not want to leave the country. What's the likelihood that I'm going to just pick up and move to some completely new part of the world after having been enslaved here? My family and ancestors have been here. Andrew Johnson becomes president after Lincoln's assassination, and while he might have remained loyal to the Union, he, as a Southerner and sometimes slave owner, certainly had some loyalties to the South, right? Or at least some sympathy for the newly vanquished South. You had some factions that, at a very basic level at least, saw the need and the importance for providing the newly freed with some type of resources for them to get started after having been held in bondage for so long. Yet he pushed back against all of that. Instead of treating them like the traitors they were, he instead provided very lenient terms for the Confederates to re-enter the Union, cutting Black people off from education, making it that they had to essentially accept whatever employment, like being forced into employment rather than them being able to choose like any free person who they wanted to work for and at what wages. Like vagrancy laws were implemented, things along those lines. Force them to work, to live and work really according to the whims of white people. In a lot of cases, these were the former slave owners, right? While they couldn't like negotiate things and whatnot, it's like they were forced into a new form of slavery. The first part of the book does a really great job of explaining how pretty much from the existence of this country, but especially from during the time leading up to the Civil War on through the years thereafter and into Reconstruction, you have this building of a society aimed at ensuring the availability of a workforce that could be exploited, primarily consisting of Black people. To curtail Black people's ability to seek, pick, and choose their employment, their housing, and whatnot, you now have vagrancy laws, loitering laws, these kinds of things put in place where essentially the local government compels you to work for specific people, removing Black people's right to self-determination. I just thought that was really interesting, the way that it's broken down here. You know, it really goes into detail about the machinations, the strategies put in place to really just attack the rights and freedom of Black people from different angles. Keeping with the concept of the book that plays into it, like white rage, which is previously expressed as the author's idea of this violent reaction to white people to any signs of Black progress. In this case, the sign of progress would be Black people now being freed, no longer enslaved, right? So the violent response was the creation of this legal, judicial, and social system aimed at keeping Black people in an inferior position within society where they could be compelled to provide cheap labor. You see the same after the so-called end of slavery, right? From the post-Civil War years to Reconstruction, and then really even into the future, where you have this creation, this structural, like this system of racism, where as explained here, you see how the government, like from the president on down to local government, create bills and laws aimed at oppressing Black people, aimed at eliminating the rights of Black people. But then also how like courts, and in this case, like examples of the Supreme Court deciding against equality for Black people. If Black people truly had the opportunity to become educated, financially independent, stable, right, through being able to seek out whatever type of employment they chose, right, to being able to get into professional trades, owning their own farms, owning their own businesses, things like that, it would decrease the options that white society would have for their laborers, for people to do the work that they didn't want to do, or that they wanted to have done at exploitative rates. Multiple examples are given here, right, of this idea where when transgressions are made against Black people are painted as being the problem. Back then it was a matter of, or even now really, Black people had to be enslaved, right? They had to be detained and jailed and whatnot. They had to be forced into convict leasing because they otherwise could not be compelled to work. This idea that a people who had worked for free for centuries while rich people pawned off their work onto them and didn't pay them, right, but rather just sat around doing nothing but passing orders, that they were the lazy ones. Who's excited about working for free or working at exploitative rates? You have this thing of painting this story of Black people as being lazy and unwilling to work. In response, they're met with violence. They're met with acts of aggression. They're met with the government intervening to force them into positions of servitude. But they're presented as being the problem. They're forcing the structure to create these systems, right? Commit an act of violence against someone unprovoked simply because they don't want to do what you want them to do. And then turning around and blaming them for your violent outbursts is a form of extreme gaslighting. Any attempts to achieve equality after having been oppressed by slavery, and even if you look at it in the years since, continued unequal treatment, attempts to bring any degree of power or parity or equality are then deemed as not being corrective or, restitution, compensation for past wrongs, as a person with other groups when, like, they're victims or of injustices is viewed as them seeking special treatment or special privileges, not as wanting to be treated as an equal or having the same opportunities as everyone else. In the society, because the perceived proper place for Black people is in a subordinate position, any attempt for you to equalize your position with the people around you, to receive some sort of corrective action for the injustices committed against you, is viewed as seeking special treatment, is viewed as you oppressing the people around you. By the time of the First World War, when opportunities began to present themselves in the North, working at factories and things like that as part of the war effort, positions were more readily available, and a lot of white men and otherwise a lot of men had been sent overseas. So it provided the first spark for a lot of Black people to move from the South to the North in search of better opportunities. In instances where, through whatever means or through sheer determination and will, a Black person managed to acquire some land or achieve any degree of success, it would often breed contempt from their white neighbors. And in a lot of instances, it would result in the person being run off. And as described here, they might find themselves having to deal with night riders and these other types of groups. The threat of violence might eventually get to the point where they would end up having to leave town, leaving behind their land, leaving behind their possessions, which would then be taken over by white citizens who, ironically, right, despite Black people being looked at as criminals living off the system, these individuals would then come in and take over this land that they had not acquired through legal means, but rather through acts of terrorism or threats of terrorism. A Black person would have to work incredibly hard to obtain any kind of property during this time because everything's built against them. Not achieving any degree of success, overcoming these obstacles, they'd still face the possibility of being forced off their land, forced to give up their land, right? Choosing between their life and their property due to racist rhetoric, the belief that these other people were more entitled than this Black person, right? That them living anything but the most demeaning life possible was an affront to white people. It was this Black person overstepping, and it would inspire acts of rage, violence. Black people were essentially the economic engine for the South and played a tremendous role in building up not just the South, but the North as well. It's explained that Black people leaving the South en masse was a twofold problem for the racist power structure in the South. Number one, it meant that their workforce was leaving. And then secondly, it kind of turned this ideology that had been pushed for quite some time about Black inferiority on its head, because it showed that Black people were motivated. Black people did want to succeed, and successful Black people were willing to work. More importantly, Black people valued self-determination, that a little bit of freedom from oppression of the South, just the promise of it, right? Black people would leave to seek better for themselves, for their children, for their families, that even with just a little bit of easing of the pressure to keep them down, Black people could and would succeed. But these artificial barriers that had been put in place were what was keeping Black people oppressed, not any type of Black pathology or trait or characteristic that made them more susceptible to poverty or these other social issues. The book then moves on to discussing Jim Crow, this system of supposedly separate but equal. Many states really just ignored, they latched onto the separate aspect because they wanted to keep the races separate. But this entire system was devised to oppress Black people. It wouldn't serve their purposes if they then separated the races to keep Black people away from resources that they were providing for white people, but then turned around and had to create equivalent resources for Black people. That wasn't part of their plan. Building a system that provided Black people with the resources and facilities they needed, that would give them a chance of operating at the same level as white people, right? Or having the same opportunities as white people. You had the development of public schools, so primary, secondary, and then also colleges and universities. But for Black people, they were barred from attending these general schools due to their race. There was a greater desire for Black people and through that Black children to work. So even from a very young age, as had been done under slavery, Black children were expected to be out in the fields or in whatever other business working within the Southern economy rather than attending school. Even when they did have schools, because quite often it would have to be established, operated, and managed supported really by the Black community. The educational resources, in addition to other resources and facilities made available for Black people, were severely limited and incredibly below par in comparison to what was being provided for white children. Charles Hamilton Houston began a campaign in the 1930s to start to push back against this idea of separate but equal. And this is where you start seeing these various court cases challenging segregated transportation, educational facilities, and whatever else and whatnot. The reality is it does not make economic sense for a community to operate separate schools as a means of dividing the population from a financial standpoint. The system of Jim Crow, if separate but equal was truly enforced, would not make financial sense because essentially you'd end up having to build two of everything. And it's like economies of scale, just the reality of how finance and money work, it would not make economic sense. The Black community pooling their money was not they weren't even relying on local government. Black people pooling their money, philanthropists or wealthy individuals from elsewhere, contributing to these communities, putting money into these communities. So this is now private funds. Putting that money together to build schools or whatever other facilities and resources would also be met with resistance. Adequate, actually good resources would be provided for white students while ensuring that Black students did not receive the resources and support that they needed to be successful in their educational careers, right? It was made very difficult for them to obtain a decent education. The goal was to make it as easy as possible to neglect Black students, and it was easy to do that by separating them. A major part of why voting rights were so important, particularly in the South, is that you have these systems in place aimed at oppressing Black people. A lot of it takes place through laws, right, through the legislative system. These are the people that make your local laws. They implement plans and procedures and whatnot for your community. They have constituencies. When they are trying to not just implement but sustain the system of oppression, they have to put in place laws, and they have to maintain and enforce those laws and programs to keep the system going. If the people that they're trying to harm with these programs have voting rights, then it will put them at risk of being voted out of office, especially as in the South, where due to slavery, you have the greatest concentration of Black people in the South, especially at this time. In some counties, Black people were the majority. They outnumbered white people. So them voting as a block in a particular county could fundamentally swing things like political power structure. This is why it was so important to the South for Black voting rights to be nullified. This is why when we began to see this push in about the 1940s or so for voting rights, that you had such a strong reaction, such a strong pushback. By putting those obstacles in the way of Black people being able to vote, it helped to ensure that lawmakers, politicians who were working to keep in place the system of white supremacy, that they'd be able to keep their positions and thereby continue rolling out laws and programs that would further oppress Black people. As you see how these different parts of the system work together to the detriment of Black people, to keep Black people in a false sense of inferiority, in a false state of inferiority, a man-made, unnatural state of inferiority within society. We see the hypocrisy that for all of this conversation about states' rights, self-determination, all of this other stuff that you hear in the South about freedom and whatnot, respect for the Constitution, all of that goes out the window when it threatens their desire for maintenance of the system of white supremacy. Examples are given of states just outright ignoring the Constitution, attempting to do away with the system of checks and balances between the three branches of government. This is something that you still see in the present. A constant thing. I believe in where it's I believe in these principles of democracy until they are at odds with the things that I believe, or until there's a conflict with the programs and policies that I'd like to have. I will say that at this point in history, meaning the civil rights era, where I disagreed was the tactic of focusing on separate rather than pushing the point of equal. That by focusing on integration, I understand the logic of it, that you want Black kids to get equal resources, right? Resources equal to what white children are getting. But that's the thing that you want. It's equal resources. I think too much focus and attention was placed on the social aspect of equality, meaning integration, in that I want my Black kids to be able to go to the same school as white kids, rather than I want my Black kids to be able to go to schools where they get an equal education. It should not have been predicated on proximity proximity to whiteness. In fighting back against segregation, more focus should have been placed on equal because of the financial ramifications that it would have. Not, I'm going to push for you to bust my kid out of like the neighborhood to another neighborhood to attend a better school, but rather I'm going to put pressure on you to either improve the schools that are here or put the money into like supporting two completely separate systems of equality. Right? You build everything new. Like there should have been some kind of financial focus on this rather than looking at it from a largely social perspective. I don't have a problem with white people. I don't think that there's anything wrong with black and white students going to school together. I think it's ridiculous to believe otherwise, right? In order to get an education, if you become friends, if you date, whatever it is, then so be it. If you don't, that's fine too. But the fact is that students are there, they're at school to get an education. And I think that regardless of whatever race you might be, you should have access to a decent quality education. It's within society's best interest that we have an educated population. Across race, across gender, income levels, we all stand to benefit from that. White supremacists focus on the separate part and ignored the equal. And I think that people who are working to eliminate segregation, they made the same mistake as well. Or they made the mistake of playing into that, where they also focused on separate and trying to bring together to achieve equality rather than focusing on equality itself. If you want to have separate water fountains, that's fine. But if yours is all nice and pristine and the water is cold until to just the right temperature, make sure the one you provide for black people are as well. If you don't want to use the same bathroom as me, you want a separate bathroom for white people, sure, go ahead. Separate bus station, you want me to sit in a separate section, that's fine. But make sure that the bathroom that you give me is just as nice as the one you have. If you want to play the fool and you don't want us to just build one nice bathroom or have one nice waiting room, one nice water fountain that everybody can use, you want them to be separate, go ahead and spend that money to make sure that mine is equally nice. If you don't want my black kid to be at school with your white children, right, in this nice school building with all these resources, that's fine, but go ahead and build another one for the black kids too. So if you want to be petty, go ahead and build two of everything. When the financial ramifications begin to take effect, let's sit down and talk. During the Cold War, when Russia launched Sputnik, it was seen as like being a really great upset. It was looked at as Russia leapfrogging America, and it was believed that it would have tremendous implications for the future of technology, the future of American defense. It became vitally important, especially to have more students going into the sciences, more students obtaining advanced education, going beyond high school. And so with that, the federal government ended up loosening the purse strings. A great amount of manufacturing was done in America and provided jobs, and not just jobs, but relatively well-paying jobs for people who did not have college educations. But this began to change in the 60s and 70s as a lot of manufacturing moved overseas or to other parts of the country. Once prosperous cities began collapsing, you have basic education, meaning K through 12 education, in some places being completely shut down for black people, right? As a way of avoiding desegregation. You have jobs going away. You now have this large amount of spending, this tremendous increase in spending in education, but it's primarily benefiting white schools. With those three factors, is it really surprising to see the trajectory of the black community? These practices of suppressing any steps towards black progress might have began during slavery and have certainly continued after its end. This is pretty much the foundation of white rage, where you have these various programs, policies, systems implemented to halt and curtail black progress. People refer to the end of the civil rights movement, this period of great sacrifice where it seemed that there was so much potential for change and things were going to get better. And for a time or to a degree, it seems like they did. The potential was there, the promise, the possibility was there, but it never really came to realization, at least on the scale and scope that was anticipated. The reason being that while there were legal wins in the Supreme Court and elsewhere, some of these programs and discriminatory policies were struck down. Quite a number of new laws and programs were never fully implemented. For example, in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, this is a case that's often pointed to. Despite segregation in schools and other areas being deemed unconstitutional, you still had various school districts that fought for like a decade or so, if not longer, to keep segregation in place, either completely ignoring the law or putting in place new segregationist programs and policies to circumvent the law. Eventually, it would shift away from blatantly state and race as like the divisionary criteria to utilize other factors, right, that are also influenced by race, but are more subtle indicators and classifiers. So like in the case of school attendance, a child could enroll in school, right, but it would be based on their home address, or having certain things be based on income levels, where after generations, in cases, centuries at this point, factors that separate the races, the disparity between black and white people, the segregation leading to black people living in very particular areas or being confined to particular areas versus white people. Those things, while on the surface, policymakers might refer to the criteria as not being based on race, right? Those criteria are largely based on or heavily influenced by race. It's no longer politically correct to blatantly state race as the defining characteristic as far as who would or would not receive resources, use of facilities, and whatnot. So now you point to other factors that are just as heavily influenced and determined by race, but could offer plausible deniability. These calls for civil rights would continue into the 70s and even into the present in some cases. You had some initiatives under President Johnson to sort of push back against poverty, to bring about some equality in other areas of society. But by the time of Nixon on through the 70s, and then especially during Ronald Reagan's administration, you pretty much had a turning back of the various civil rights legislation, where they would either strip funding from programs or through the Supreme Court and elsewhere would really just whittle down these judgments to the point where things would return to where they were in the 60s, if not earlier. They learned how to use coded language to convey equally racist and prejudiced ideas, to continue speaking into like the base, right, the values for the system of segregation. The gains of the civil rights era were important, but kind of reached a point where they did not go far enough in changing and restructuring society to better enforce civil rights and equality across the board. Examples are also provided of like this push to make it difficult to enforce laws that were anti-segregation, right, or against inequality, right? So that only in the most blatant cases of discrimination would you be able to enforce these laws. And so with this, you have this emergence of the idea of colorblindness, where in the past, society was divided up by race, and people were then categorized accordingly. Their economic prospects and such reflected their position in this hierarchy. When it now comes to time and there's now an expectation to correct some of those past injustices that were based on race, there's now this push to no longer recognize race, that we now live in this colorblind society. Whereas when all the time when white people were benefiting from the system, or more accurately, black people were being oppressed by the system, there were no calls for guarding against race-based language. Factions that would hope to keep these practices in place began to push back against discussions of racism, allegations of racism, and whatnot. And they began to promote this idea of us living in a colorblind society, where this society that's largely based on race and people's economic position within it is based on their race, right? There's been no real overhauling or restructuring of the system. Rather, what's done is that people now say, you know what, we had the civil rights movement and now we no longer need to talk about race. Everything is fine. There's no need for any further action. We can just stop there. Never mind that they still continue to affect people in the present, where programs and things like that had been put in place to kind of help give black people a leg up after generations, hundreds of years actually, at this point of them being subjugated and oppressed. You now have calls for, of government overspending. It's called handouts, all of these other little negative connotations. And as a result of that, you see that resources that the government had been providing to black people, had been providing to the poor to kind of help to even out society, are now being rolled back. You never really hear about America's defense budget being cut. The military seems to pretty much get whatever they want, billions, if not trillions of dollars spent on the military, even when we're not at war. But then there's always calls to cut back on education, nutrition programs, different programs that would help regular citizens in America, and help America over the long term. White families typically have more money and have more wealth in comparison to black families. And so with that, over time, we have a compounding of this wealth gap. Now, at points, it's narrowed a bit, but pretty much by like the 70s, 80s, it had began to expand again. As these programs and policies are being rolled back, new ones are being implemented to sort of start this new era of black oppression. And so what would then end up happening is funding for schools would largely it'd be based on property taxes, right? Or local taxes in the area, primarily property taxes. Because of the geographic segregation of America and then the wealth gap, the economic oppression of black people that had existed for hundreds of years, whereas white people had been free to work, achieve, save, and things like that, build, even if it was a small amount of wealth, it was something. White families, white neighborhoods, not saying each and every individual family, but generally, they would have more economic resources. They would have greater household income. They would have more wealth, which would mean that because of property values, their tax base would be stronger. Their tax base would be larger, which means that the schools in their neighborhoods would be able to receive more funding. There would be more spending on each child because the tax coffers are fuller in these areas, which then meant that the schools would typically be a better quality, and the children that attended them will have better odds of success. This foundation of economic stability, having access to resources, makes things easier, provides you with more resources. You accumulate more wealth over generations, and a huge determining factor in that is access to education. They'd have a better chance of moving through K through 12, graduating from high school, and with that, they would be better prepared for college. More of them would then go on to attend college. With that, they'd have more options after graduation for employment. They'd be able to achieve more stable employment, better paying jobs. They'd be able to buy homes, to better provide for their children, to better provide for themselves, to prepare for their old age. They would then be able to provide for their children, to provide for their families as their parents had done for them. And this is now where you have this thing of generational wealth coming into play. In efforts to further these goals of rolling back the gains that they began to kind of create situations and scenarios to further their aims, one of which was developing this idea of the war on drugs, which would then lead to mass incarceration. The book actually does a really great job of, within just a few pages, explaining the Iran-Contra conflict and how basically the American government, in efforts to support the overthrow of like a communist government in Central America, worked with various politicians, government entities, and also narco traffickers to basically bring drugs into America. I've come to understand from this book, as well as others, that the war on drugs was pretty much created at a time when drug use was actually plateauing, if not declining in some regard. Much was the same with incarceration. Pretty much the government and these policymakers created problems that would effectively lead to rises in drug use, violence associated with drugs, and pretty much the drug trade, right? Causing a spike in the incarceration of the American population overall, but especially within the Black community. In addition to rolling back policies and programs that benefited poor people, that benefited especially Black people, you had the cutting of these various funds and programs where by the 80s, Ronald Reagan was slashing budgets for departments within the government, some of whom were large employers of Black people, right at the time that manufacturing jobs were also going away. Different policies were put in place, becoming more and more strict with regards to sentencing. And then the disparity came about in sentencing between people involved in the sales of cocaine versus those who were found to be in possession of crack, right? Largely because of how the races were seen as being associated with one versus the other, while there's no real difference between the two drugs. You have the same administration declaring a war on drugs, creating conditions where more people would use or sell drugs, and providing a pathway for drugs to be brought into the country through like the Iran-Contra agreement. They created the drug problem, redefined prosecution of drug crimes, and with that began filling up prisons with Black people. They made it okay for contraband to be brought into the country, created the conditions for people to turn to crime, and then prosecuted them for it. The book goes into discussion of the pushback against the election of President Barack Obama. We're sure he was voted into office, but because that was largely made possible through a huge amount of new voter turnout, particularly from groups and demographics that Republicans prefer to see remain inactive with regards to voting, there was pushback. If you look back to during like the civil rights movement and prior to, you had this very openly hostile resistance to Black progress and achievement. But with the civil rights movement, by the 70s and 80s, it was no longer acceptable to be openly racist. With the rise of Barack Obama, you now had this very prominent example of Black achievement. You then had this very hostile, openly hostile, aggressive response in reaction to his campaign and later election, his later presidency. It's explained here, and I've heard it elsewhere, that as a candidate, he received protection from the Secret Service far earlier than any other candidate. There was a strong uptick in death threats and other things along those lines, threatening and violent language aimed towards him. Once he became president, suddenly you have regular people as well as politicians feeling very comfortable using racist language towards Obama, a sitting president. Seemingly all decorum was thrown out the window by people who felt uncomfortable with a Black person occupying this position. Granted, I don't think that Barack Obama was a perfect president. But part of the reason that Donald Trump was able to become president was because Barack Obama had been president. You had people who as had been done throughout America's history, ignored their own hardships and oppression in exchange for continued idea of their white supremacy. And you've had these great people, these great figures in history, these activists and policymakers, things like that. They've put in effort. Trying to bring about some degree of equality, the amount of intelligence, effort, and energy that had been expended to pursue those goals. Consider how much further along America would be if those activists and policymakers had been able to, instead of wasting their efforts on just trying to get black people, poor people, or whoever, to just be treated as basic human beings within American society, if instead of just putting all of that effort behind the obtainment of basic rights, imagine how much further along American society would be if they put that into just progress, true progress. Imagine how much further along we would be if, first of all, there had been no slavery and everyone had just started out on an equal footing. Everyone had been able to achieve and to pursue economic progress without facing oppression. Or even, let's say, after slavery, that Reconstruction had been allowed to truly take hold, that the government had provided some means of restitution to the newly freed. Imagine what the black community would be now economically. Imagine if during the New Deal era, black people had been allowed to share in the spoils of that progressive movement. Every year you have politicians talking about overinflated government spending, the need to cut back on government spending. You see cuts in funding for education, healthcare, mental health, food programs, etc. America is an incredibly wealthy nation, but yet you have so many people, children included, that go to bed hungry every night. Children without access to a quality education. Consider children who are denied access to resources in their childhood, and it sets them on a pipeline to prison. But somehow they're able to find money for wars. The defense budget is always increasing, never decreases. Instead of investing in things that would cut down on crime, meaning job training, treatment for people that are addicted, mental health programs, etc., the focus is placed on punitive means. So the militarization of police, further expansion of the prison industrial complex. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website by the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.